Jim Taylor, thanks very much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm doing great, David. Thanks for inviting me. Glad to be here.
So you have a fascinating background,
Uh,
some which has unrelated to cybersecurity, but and this is what I love about this industry because the folks that are in this industry come from all walks of life with different backgrounds, and I think that's what collectively creates the strength of the industry is that they have the ability for people from diverse backgrounds to come in and contribute. So why don't we clean our palates and just walk me through memory lanes, like just how you got to where you are today.
so I originally, when I was very young, I actually wanted to run restaurants. I worked at restaurants since I was, a young teenager. And eventually, I went to school for engineering, like early days of computer aided drafting and design kind of stuff. And I started working for a research and development firm. And in that process, it's basically got exposed to a security situation, let's just call it that way. And I started looking into it more deeply, and I kind of found I had a knack for it. And so I was able to, kind of understand how this person connected to our systems and how things were happening. This is 93, right? So pretty early on. And,
So Jim, from
yeah,
culinary
yeah,
to
yeah, right.
you could have picked the wrong, the different fork in the road, and it would have been like,
Yeah.
the chef.
The chef thing, right? Yeah. I was tired of like waiting on tables kind of thing and cooking and all that kind of stuff. And then I had an opportunity to take like this engineering school opportunity, and I went that direction. And I remember it was using, we had, back when DOS was pre-Windows kind of thing, and you had to learn how to do stuff on computers and make them kind of do what you wanted them to do. And started getting into programming. And then that led me into working in design and in mechanical design, specifically in this case. And through that, I got exposed. I was like building the network. Like, how do I make all these computers work together and all this kind of stuff? So kept getting pulled more to the technology, whether it be programming. I actually had a software company back a long time ago. I was writing software for engineering solutions, and then this would happen. Yeah, and this is this interesting thing is I tell a lot of people who say I want to get into security, and I always say is like find something that makes you tick, and then find that path. And a lot of people worry about where they want to end up. Oh, I want to be a pen tester. I want to do this. I want to do this. It's like, no, just go in. Because once you're in, you're going to learn different things that pull you in different paths, right? So, try to explore what gravitates you to and makes it fun, I guess, for you. And then you'll find your natural home at some point. It'll happen. Kind of thing.
And it doesn't sound to me, at least, that it was planned. It sounds like you were positioning yourself to be in certain,
Yeah.
the certain industry, and then one opportunity lends itself to another, to another, to another.
Yep.
And I think that's what happens today with a lot of people. People, it's very hard to. I mean, some people do it. Some people have like a mindset to plan ahead, like where they want to be in the next 5 years. But most people are just kind of drifting. But potentially, you can drift to the right direction if you're positioning yourself to be in the right space.
I think you have to be willing to open yourself up to opportunity, right? You have to always be looking for a challenge and gravitate to challenge. Even if something doesn't seem interesting, try it. I mean, some people say, oh, well, you're wasting your time. I think there's a lot to learn from trying a lot of different things. But for me, it was the technology. And then I just kept moving closer and closer to technology and moving in that way. And then it just evolved. And I always tell people that want to get into security or people who are getting into it is you have to be curious and willing to constantly be learning all that kind of stuff. I know we say that a lot today, but even in the early days, if you're not curious about something, you're going to be kind of dead in the water kind of thing, right?
100%. And curiosity is almost like a common thread, a theme with the people that I interviewed. They seem to be curious about the world in general, and then specifically about how things work, how to take things apart. And so in the early days, when you were like looking at networks and seeing how the parts are working, I'm assuming today is much easier actually, like, because you have a lot of how-tos and YouTubes and, FAQs, and now with ChatGPT, you can answer the questions. But back in the day, it was a lot of like roll up the sleeves and figure it out. Talk to me about the experience.
it's an interesting double-edged sword, because today there's a lot more out there than I think there was in the old, cloud and all that kind of stuff. But there's so much there's so much available to you get to make yourself better, and YouTube and all those different things that you can learn from. Back in the day, you had to write all your own stuff, right? If you wanted to attack a computer, or you wanted to scan for a vulnerability, which, you pretty much had to either write it, script it, know how to compile it, build your own systems, troubleshoot it. And so today, like even before, say, Kali backtrack kind of thing, you still had to get tools, know how to compile them, make them run. And they didn't come with man pages. There was no manual. You didn't look up there was nothing to look at. So you had to figure it out. So a lot of times in the old days, we use these tools, and we would have to build labs and make them work and understand what they're doing, and then manipulate them to kind of do what we needed to do. So early days for me was pen testing. I think a lot of people, even to this day, get into security for pen testing, and then things evolve from there. But in those days, 90% of it was absolutely manual. You were taking apart things, and again, the environments were not nearly as complicated, right? So I couldn't hack my way out of a paper bag today, but you had to really know the technology. I vividly remember, soldering, cans on a modem, so I could basically attack a system through dial-up, but I had to make it work a certain way. So it was kind of interesting. So when you look at today, there's not a lot of hands-on necessarily in that way, but it is different. I mean, it's not necessarily old was more complex. You just had to apply a lot of curiosity and be willing to break a lot of things in the process.
And there's sounds to me like it was a lot of grunt work. And that's, I think partially that's still it is, right? There's a lot of things that you have to do. It's like staking when you're, like a cop and you're staking a potential event. So you can be there for 20 hours and nothing happened, and then all of a sudden, boom. And the same goes for pen testing, right? So you're trying, and then you find a thread that you can pull on. Right. So
it was very difficult because, again, without a lot of tools to help you synthesize information, or there was no such thing as CVS or things like that. Right. So you had to let me try this packet. And you had to assume that there was a hole there to get into. There was always a hole, right? No matter what anybody would tell you. So you knew there was one at least. So it was a very humbling experience, because the more you tried and didn't find anything, the more you started questioning your skill and your knowledge, and were you any good? Because the really good testers, I'm not saying I was one, but I'm saying good testers are always good security people always assume there's a massive hole anyway, right? So if you couldn't find it, it was really kind of a thing. And in the team I was part of at the time, it was, if you didn't crack into something, they knew it, you knew it, they'd let you know it, that kind of thing. And there was a weird byproduct, because you could get yourself into a lot of trouble, because you had to stay within the scope of the activity, and so you didn't want to necessarily break something or do something that wasn't, legit or ethical in that process, right? So sometimes you try so hard and you start breaking things.
And do you have, and I'm sure because you've done a lot, I'm sure are there any memorable events that maybe you came across, or something you did, and either both on the successful side and not the successful side that comes to mind, and you're looking back and maybe that was a very, very good learning experience?
I can give you one that I guess successful, unsuccessful is kind of a interesting dichotomy. But I would say is one time I was so intent on hacking this company that I ended up hacking into this system and basically made myself essentially what will amount to as an employee, basically, in the system. And when I gave to go give the debrief, and I was walking the executive community through my debrief, they were walking people out of the room. They were letting people go on the spot. And I was like, that is not what I ever envisioned happening, right? And I remember the CIO at the time, he goes, I want you to see something. And he walked me, and we went through a man trap, biometric door, steel doors into an operations center behind cages. And we went to this cage room, and he pointed at the stack of computers, and he goes, that's what you broke into. So I was able to, it was a real awakening very early in my career that, we think remotely and we hack and we do stuff and we talk about things, but eventually somebody's job is tied to it and there's a blinking light somewhere. And so for me, very early in my career, I made that connection very, very quick. And I think that kind of changed a little bit of my trajectory. But I would say that's a double-edged sword of success or failure. I don't want anybody to get fired because of what I did. But I mean, wow. It was like a tsunami through that organization. It wasn't necessarily easy in that sense. But I think failures would be, I never liked pinholing. So you find one vulnerability and then you just kind of scoot through and then you just sort of start tearing down the walls, right? You start tearing down. It's like breaking into a home and then like just trashing all the furniture, Once you're in the home, there's no need to trash everything in the room, right? And so, you don't want to do that. So I think there are a lot of times where I would say, look, I found this problem, but, exploiting it and proving it to you, I think I can just tell you that your problem's there. I don't need to turn over the dining room table kind of thing. So, but I always kind of frowned on pinholing kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So it's almost beware for what you ask for, in terms of being successful. Now, if you don't mind, I'll double click on that. I think that's the issue we have with the whole digital realm, like hacking, because when you physically attack someone and you take away something, you can look them in the eyes, you can see the grief that they currently have. But what happened is you have the adversary sitting in a different country somewhere. They go in and they hack a bunch of blinking lights, and it's all very almost like neutral in a way. Like it's almost like they don't see any of the outcome, even though there is an outcome. There is a tremendous outcome. As you mentioned, and people get, for example, hacked, or they get business email compromised, right? They get their life savings stolen from them. So
all
the time, or they get hacked by other means. But my point is, what you just described on the adversary side, that they don't see what you saw. The fact that somebody can lose their life savings and then potentially there's domino effect, the consequences for their family, for their loved ones, everybody else around them, because all they do in their mind is just going in and, modifying some bits and bytes.
Yeah. I mean, think about, if you want to get a little esoteric and kind of big picture, is humans are very social, right? We're really good at knowing faces, and we're very good at connecting, human connections and stuff like that. And so the birth of the internet created the ability to do similar things, but over a distance, right? And then over time, I think that is kind of created this separation a little bit. So I think we have overcompensated. So we're very close to family and friends we interact with every day, and everybody else is this distant echo of a human, right? And so you don't even think about it. It's just a computer. What kind of harm can be had there? But there's, countless stories of, especially sadly recently, with, healthcare organizations being ransomed and stuff like that. And, people in some cases are dying, right? They're not getting the services they need. Their equipment has errors and stuff like that. And meanwhile, the people on the other side that are perpetrating these crimes, that they're not making that connection. I think in some cases they avoid making that connection on purpose, or in most cases they just don't care. And as we move forward, it's becoming very, very easy to separate yourself from all that, right? So I think there's a human element in the digital world that we need to kind of hold on to as a animal. But I think in cybersecurity, one of the things we have to recognize is threats don't take that into consideration. So you can't, when you go to think like a threat and you do threat analysis and you're trying to connect the dots on whether it be probability or all the different components that make up a threat characterization, you have to extract any humanization out of it. You can't apply your own sort of thinking. Well, why would they do that? Somebody could die. Well, they couldn't care less. More or less, they probably don't even really understand it, right?
Yeah, and on the flip side, as the victims, the problem is we haven't, as you described, it's everything become digitized, but we haven't evolved. Meaning, we're still, evolutionary product that is to like to trust. You like to believe. That's why it's almost so easy for somebody to impersonate, or because we like to believe the other person on the other side wants to help me.
Or is real.
Or is real, for that matter. Yeah, so we haven't evolved to create and I think from evolutionary perspective, we were paranoid, right? We're supposed to be a little bit paranoid because that was saves us. But I think the paranoia doesn't necessarily translate too much about online. It is too synthesized. Like it's too, the cues are not there. Like, for example, reason why we don't like certain smells is because from an evolutionary perspective, those smells is an indicator that this thing is bad for you, right?
Absolutely.
So you don't eat it or you don't go close
Absolutely.
to it, right?
That's it.
But we don't have it. We don't have a bad smell for an email that comes in.
That'd be nice.
Maybe,
Maybe
so we haven't evolved.
Something. Yeah.
So we haven't evolved, and that's why in security professional always say, well, the issue is between the keyboard and the chair. This like the human element is always the kind of the weakest link.
So I'm really glad you brought this up because sometimes I talk about this and I get people looking at me funny when I start talking about like, how the brain works and histories of evolution, which you're dead spot on. So no need to add 2 cents to that. And of course, if you look at what magicians do, very old profession, it's all about knowing how the brain works and using it. Now that science of manipulation, which used to be pretty high-end science, we're talking, high-end governmental organizations that really understand how the human thinks to be able to do what they do. Now anybody can access that kind of thing. But I think the interesting, in addition to that, what's happening is that you're not able to interpret those things. And like you said, our evolution hasn't been able to catch up with some of these dynamics. The part specifically about the problem being between the keyboard and the chair, there's an aspect of that I'm not a big fan of, where people blame users, stupid users, stupid this kind of thing. And then we try to train them. The thing is what we're not doing is we're not embracing as a security community or even in a technology community, we're not fully embracing the human formula in it. We are taking computers and we're pushing it into the human realm. And the byproduct is all the things we understand in security, like bad passwords and clicking on bad links, which is not going to go away with today's, awareness training. So I think in some ways we're responsible for building better protections, which I think we're doing. But I think it's also in how we change how we interact with people in the computing world, right? So it's not just the computer you're using. It is how we interface everything around us these days, how we buy, meet people, all that kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot to be done there. But I think it's time to take a step back and go, we really need to understand how humans interpret things and then find ways of improving how we interact with computers in some way.
And then, to add to the complexity, and I think we're going to get to the point where we're discussing why is cybersecurity such a big issue still after millions and millions of dollars, millions of people hours trying to develop tools to protect us. So to add to what we just discussed is the complexity is ever increasing. We're becoming more of we've always been a knowledge-based economy in the past, I would say several years. And then every becoming, digital transformation kind of thing. And we're becoming digitized, further and further, everything is becoming, data. And so the complexity is exponentially becoming increasing. And it doesn't really matter if you manufacture widgets or have as you mentioned, a hospital. We are starting to rely heavily on technology no matter what. And then therefore, now you have almost endless attack surface, and we're not able to protect. So, leads me to the next question. You've seen trends in this space, right? So because you start early, and you were in the right spot, in the nuts and bolts of it, like, being a pen tester when pen tester was like real hands-on. I mean, the day is like all
we didn't call it pen testing. We didn't call it pen testing. That was
what was it called? Do you remember?
No, you were just a security guy. You were attacked. You were attacker is really what we refer to it as. Pen testing came on a little bit later, I think.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and we're still behind. It seems like we're still not solving the issue. I mean, literally, we're just at the tail end of AT&T announcing that almost it's all of its customers are, and who is not an AT&T customer?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Think of all the companies that ride on AT&T networks as well, right? So I think there's the whole third-party risk thing. Here's what pretty much 2 to 3 things I always tell people. One is complexity, security's nemesis, right? So the more complex the system, the more sophisticated it is, the more touch points between attributes of a system creates essentially what I also refer to as security camouflage. So when you look at pulling up a basic computer, right? I don't even know if those exist anymore, but you pull up something and you're at the command prompt. Your interface to that computer is only a handful of layers, right? You got a command line, you know it's interpreting it, machine language, and so forth, right? But as we add layers, like we do with our cell phones, right? There's so much happening, but it's just a little icon, especially your thumb kind of thing. So as we obfuscate and create these depths, right? That gives more layers, more camouflage for bad things to happen. Then we create the increased complexity to drive simplicity in many ways. We create these additional, I would argue unnecessary layers, but these additional layers that allow us to communicate across a broader web of interaction, right? So before it was just HTML, you go to a website and you get something and it was a hyperlink, right? Super stupid, easy. Then came everything else, right? So now all of a sudden there's ways of interacting with different applications, communities, processes.
Web3.
Web3, exactly, right? So it's only getting worse, right? So what we've done, going back to the human element, is the complexity has increases exponentially, but on the human side, we've pushed very hard to make it fully obfuscated, right? In other words, it's super simple to consume the technology. Oh, just drag and drop and just point here. And
keep it simple, stupid.
Exactly, right? And so while the surface is very placid and shiny and looks like you want to just dive right in, right? Nice warm lake, you don't know. It's just full, it's teeming with dragons and whatever else you can dream up. And they're just coming in up under and the water is getting deeper. Well, that's where bad guys live. That's where threats live, right? And so it's become really easy. So the reason why we're not making progress is the expansion of the technical universe in the form of its complexity is expanding exponentially, where our ability to really understand it is not as moving as fast. People who create it know it. The people who adopt it, they make it easy to adopt. And then all of a sudden, hackers and bad guys and threats and nation state actors find ways to get in there. And they're also willing to spend the time that's necessary, as opposed to the creators of these solutions that are necessarily willing to spend the time to create those security capabilities. And I'm not calling anybody out. It's just no matter how much we say it, security will never be first unless you're building something for security, you know?
Right. And so today you are in position to assist some of these organizations to bring them to a level that's manageable. They're never going to eliminate all the entire, the risk they have. So talk to me about that. The people that I've talked to always have some sort of philosophy of how they approach this endeavor, and it's really difficult. It's like somebody who has maybe psychological problems sits around and meets a psychiatrist and say, tell me a bit about what's going on.
Yeah,
so
yeah, exactly.
Where do you start? Like where does the engagement start? How do you approach it? And then how do you measure success? I guess incremental success.
Yeah, you're asking big questions, my friend. Okay. So first, let's just say the opposite. It sort of depends on...
I said it's going to be easy, but
you said easy, and then you totally changed gears on me. This is supposed to be an easy one.
We warmed up a little bit.
Yeah, we did. Okay. So I'm usually brought in when there's a primary driving, like there's a picture on the horizon, right? So let's say maybe it's compliance, or maybe it's, we need to deal with this merger and acquisition. There's usually some sort of driving characteristic. But I would say is probably my number one thing is I try to be very pragmatic, right? I try not to get overexcited about things, right? So when people talk about, ransomware, which is a real thing, BEC, real thing, right? All these kind of stuff. I'm not saying they're not real. It's just, you don't have to go through an in-depth risk assessment and analysis and do all the fancy bells and whistles to know what really you need to align yourself with, right? So I think the big thing for me is if you're not careful, it's very easy to boil the ocean in security. You can fix 1,000 different things and you can miss 1,000 things. So you want to just be pragmatic, right? Just kind of walk through it in a very pragmatic way and understand where really the long pole in the tent is. Where is the greatest potential for an impact, right? And that can be operational, it can be people-wise. The other day I can't really tell these stories because...
you can obfuscate some of the details.
Yeah. So basically, I was shown something that I was like, okay, that's really bad, like super bad. right? You're going to get hacked, right? But the fact of the matter is I knew in the big scope of things, right, that I needed to not distract from this other thing, okay? And I knew by doing the other thing, it would bleed to fix this. So the probability of that getting exploited was this lower in retrospect, right, than this bigger thing. Because you have to kind of set these, not necessarily goals. You know, a lot of people have, well, we need to have these 5 strategic objectives, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't really do that. What I try to say is like, we need to make sure that we maintain focus in this area, because I can connect the dots, you can connect the dots, but if we're not careful, we'll have 100 different things to do. So let's really kind of focus on these towers.
But Jim, so the pragmatism, if that's even a word, is that because you have the expertise and the years of kind of seeing that? Like if I am watching this and I said, well, that makes total sense, but what does it actually mean? And can I do it? Or do I have to get you to do it for me? How can I adopt pragmatism in my organization and define that, what are the most, important things to deal with and not go sideways? Because it's so easy, as you mentioned, it's so easy to go out and start chasing things that don't matter.
So, I mean, it's kind of it's going to sound very self-serving. You need to have the bruises and the scars. That's not the first time I've said that, right? So, but I don't want people getting into the industry going like, look at this old guy, and I'm not going to wait 30 years to know that, right? I don't want to create any kind of barrier, but it's as you use each of your muscles, right? You get stronger in those areas. Every time you get a scar, every time something happens, you learn from it, right? And so that kind of goes back to something we talked about earlier, is like, keep trying, go do things that you don't even like. Like I know people like, I want to be a threat hunter. And, and they, 6 months ago, they were, delivery truck driver or doing something different. And now they want to be a threat hunter. Go for it. Right. But don't corner yourself, right? Expose yourself, challenge yourself, put yourself in positions to fail or get exposed to failure. Failure is the quickest thing you can learn from. So I would say is, yes, you can do it. But the fastest way through that is learn from other people's mistakes and know where things go bad. But you have to expose yourself to a lot of different stuff. So the answer is dare I say, experience. But, you can obtain experience through just, reading, listening, watching what happens. But also importantly is get to know what really happened under the covers, man. I mean, there are massive hacks we talk about. People are like, oh, this massive hack. Then you find out it was this one thread. You're like, okay, well,
I agree that it's amazing. Yeah. And we talk about kill chain, that it's just like a small thing, but that small thing, and it's almost like it's not that one thing. Also, it's a chain of events that you could have stopped at any moment.
Yep.
To not continue. What about frameworks, like security frameworks? Do you like any of them? Do you utilize them as part of the kind of the pursuit for, to better the organization?
In most cases, I'll lean on NIST, CSF for entry level, basic. Like if you just want to draw a circle around your security program, that one's kind of straightforward. I use, like, you have to understand, back in the early days, man, I sound like an old man, is British Standards Institute, right? They're the ones that came up with BS 7799, right? And then when they came out with the second version, then you had part 1 and part 2, and that was, 97 and 99, I think. And then, ISO adopted it, and then now we have what we have. I'm actually not a huge fan of the ISO stuff now. I think it's slow to change, I think, in some cases. I think the reason why I like the special publications from NIST is because there's an incremental component to it. There's there's elements that are more actionable in some cases. So I think what I do is I look at ISO as a way of like a starting point. And I look at CSF as a way of kind of connecting like critical dots in some cases. I'm glad they added governance recently. That was a big missing point. But then I'll lean heavily, especially in the federal space, I'll lean heavily on 853 because there's a lot happening in there. I lean a little away from CIS. I'll use CIS controls for specific needs, right? So back in the old days, we used to call them STIGs. I think STIGs are still around. So CIS I treat like a STIG. If I need to get something specifically done, I'll go straight to CIS for a control. Like, here's what you need to do for the controls. But the framework is usually something more broad. CSF is usually like a good go-to as a starting point.
And then,
If I may add one more
super.
thing,
Yeah, go ahead.
the anything to do with capability maturity model. So the SSE CMM kind of emerged in the sort of 95 through 99 period, late 90s. And so I'm a big fan on proper application of capability maturity modeling. Been doing it for a very long time. There's a lot of people that have been doing it for a long time. I think there's an opportunity to kind of reinvestigate that art form a little bit. So I believe that you can do something really sophisticated in security and do it very, very poorly. You can spend a lot of money and not be secure in a meaningful way. But I know, I won't mention them of course, but I know very big organizations that have a very mature security program. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's hyper sophisticated because they were able to exploit the fundamentals of what needed to get done. And they're very mature in doing those fundamentals. And they're very secure. I mean, some of them are financial institutions, right?
And everything has to be incremental, meaning it's not like you're one and done. It's almost like it's a project that never ends. Getting into bettering the organization. So how do you incrementally improve, and how do you measure that the organization is moving in the right direction and you're moving the needle on it?
Okay. The first order of business is make sure that the policies, processes, standards, guidelines, all these kind of things first are plugged together, that you're performing them as expected, right? So a lot of people talk about measuring something for determining success or how many, like I'll see a lot of metrics that I call measuring the weather, right? I can tell you it's sunny and not raining outside just by looking out the window. So I don't need a measurement necessarily for that. And more importantly is I can't influence it. So don't measure anything you can't influence. Okay. So I start with really basic things. So for example, it says in a policy, I'm going to do this. I put some sort of every 90 days or change your password kind of thing. Is that set as a policy set? Great. Are we monitoring that policy, right? Is it across all the systems, And so it's just connecting the simple little dots across. And then once that system's in place, then you monitor it, make sure it's okay. Then you go, how do I improve it? And that's when I believe the key KPIs start coming in place. I think there's a tendency in security, there's two things we do too soon. One, we try to automate too quickly. That's number one. And two, we try to measure effectiveness too early before we are willing to look at the entire ecosystem. So you'll see parts of security programs spike way up. Like, we're really mature here, right? Well, great. It's like saying you matured your window washing. You got all this other stuff you need to worry about, right? So you change your oil in your car every 5,000 miles, but your tires are bald. So you have to more look at it as an entire ecosystem, an organism. And you said like a project that's never ending, right? Well, it's an organism. You have to constantly be massaging all the parts of it. But I would say is most people don't want to be in the trenches. They want to do the cool stuff, and KPIs are fun and cool and all that kind of stuff. When in reality, really good security is crunching it every day and just connecting those dots from when you define it to making sure you get what you define. Measure, inspect what you expect, right? Is what a lot of my friends have always said and what I've learned, but expect what you measure, right? So you always want to make sure that you're challenging your measurements as well. I know I didn't answer your question very well.
No, it's really good. And it sounds also from what you described. Yeah, everybody is looking at the cool stuff.
Yeah.
It sounds like you can get significant improvements from not a lot of like investment in capital, for example, or investment in technology. What you describe is like, for example, they make sure that you have a policy about how often do you change your password and to what extent, and that it's across all systems, and how do you monitor that? That doesn't sound to me like a huge endeavor or a costly one. Well, but it's not cool. It's not like, when your a significant other asks you like at the end of the day, what have you done? You say, well, I was responsible for the password management. It's not something you can boast about, right?
Super boring, right? Everybody want to do cool stuff until it's time to do the boring stuff to do cool stuff. That is a reality. We were human. Nobody likes to do the same boring thing every day. You just don't want to do it. And I'm one of them, right? I hate it too, just as much as the next guy. But you can get so much bang for your buck. just by, did you set it up? Did you implement it correctly? And are you using it as intended? And is the environment changing to the point where you need to reinvestigate that? If you can just do those things across the entire spectrum, you're going to be in great shape, honestly.
But Jim, like there are 5,000 vendors out there that will beat you up. So no, you gotta buy the latest
Automate. It's AI. It's all that kind of good stuff.
orchestration, automation. You know, you got to improve all of that before you even start thinking about, you know, the basic hygiene of your passwords. Well, we can fix it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, when we talk basic, I think what people understand is like, oh, well, that's just basic stuff. Reality. What I'm saying is do the basics consistently, establish a solid foundation, and then all of a sudden all those things will work. But I liken the tools to, I got a lawnmower, I got like 3 chainsaws, I've got, weed whackers, all this kind of stuff, right? I hate like having to deal with the maintenance on these things, right? So I try to find ways of minimizing my maintenance, right? So in other words, like legacy platforms or tech debt, like people call it, right? And so I think is in our rush to get something new, we thinking it's helping us, we're creating debt. We're creating debt and security that we have to pay later in different forms. And I also want to say something is a lesson I actually learned from Microsoft. There's a report came out from Microsoft a gazillion years ago about the concept of how people use like Excel and Word and PowerPoint, those 3 major things, right? And Project at the time, I think. And it was determined that people only use like 5% of the features in these platforms. And that was the impetus of like Office Online and all that kind of stuff from, years ago. And I remember this was many years ago, I was sitting with an organization. I was like, well, how many tools have you invested just in the last, 18 months? And it was like 50 tools in security. I'm like, great. What do you believe is the level of implementation and integration? 15%, 10%, right? Because we could detect that, right? And I was like, well, what features are you using? So we created this matrix of all the tools, what were all the features, and what they were being used. And in most cases, they were using, there was conflicting features, there were overlaps in features, and none of them was more than, say, 40% totally utilized, right? Cisco actually did a study even before that, back in the early 2000s, about, router technology and routing protocols and all that kind of stuff. And it really dawned on me is like people just buy things because it's cool, it's new, they've been convinced, they got a deal on it, or leadership changes, right? Somebody comes in and says, I don't like this technology, I like this technology, and then it stacks up. And I think we need to take a step back and look at really what are we trying to accomplish and look at it from a debt perspective and look at outcomes as driving equity, right? So how do I build value out of this so it continues to pay dividends to my security program and it's a value to the business as opposed to absorbing costs? And now I've basically told the business, you got to spend $100 million. And like, a year later, I'm asking for 110 million. They're like, wait a second. And so I know I'm kind of babbling a little bit, but I find more often than not that there's plenty of vendors to fill that space. And the reason why is because we think we're going to buy our way out of this problem because we don't want to do the heavy lifting. We don't want to paint the bridge. We don't want to dig the ditch. And I'm telling you, the best security people I know are the ones that I thank every day that are just doing the hard work under the scenes. You can point your fingers till you're purple in the face, but somebody's got to do the hard work. And that's where real security is happening. It's not happening in at events and people trying to sell you products,
But maybe, again, it's a part of the recognition, right? You're an executive and then the board comes over and asks you, okay, what have you done? First of all, they might hear it on the news, right? Like a vast persistent threat, nation state, blah, blah, blah. So instead of saying, oh, I revamped our security by increasing the how often we change the password, that doesn't as cool as like spending $2 million on a advanced persistent threat system that may or may not sit in your hallway for the next 15 months because that's exactly what happens. Or even worse, I've seen cases where they invested so much money on an MDR, and when something happens, they didn't even have the log function turned on.
Yeah.
And that what I'm saying is true. And then the CFO comes over and say, what's going on? We just spent $1 gazillion on a system, and what do you mean it wasn't doing what it's supposed to be doing?
Yeah.
And
And
so,
that falls directly into, we're trying to solve a problem. Like, say, for example, we're trying to create a better set of barriers, but we're not prepared for when they come over the wall, right? So I always come at it from, okay, can I win this fight? Okay, the fight's already started. The knives are out, right? So can I win the fight? Then I'm like, okay, I got my business in order, right? I got the right gear. I'm set up for when they come over the wall. Now let's build the wall, right? Let's do our best to defend against the threats that we know, but we're prepared for when they slip through. And I think we're constantly trying to find technologies that help stop. We got to stop that. When in fact, we're not really prepared for the fight. We're not prepared for the incident. And when I was working at Kivu as COO there, right, I got to see a lot of things. A lot of great people work there. I think sure still do, of course. And it's amazing what you see in these incidents and the human impact, for starters. First of all, incident responders, people who are working in companies that are hopefully listening to that respond to incidents, man, you men and women are doing like you're exposed to the worst. And then when people get hacked, I mean, grown men, grown women, executives crying on conference calls, it's brutal, right? And so the thing is it always shocks me how people just aren't prepared, but that's the human nature, right? We're not all prepared for every situation because it takes time and energy, and you spend money and you don't see the benefits of that money, kind of thing. So my theory is why we spend a lot of money and the CFO shows up after you've been attacked and goes, what do you mean it's not collecting logs for us to do an investigation, right? You start off with, okay, what are the means by which to recover operationally, financially, and legally, right? So you have to think in that responsibility and that stand front, and then you work outwardly from there. And right now, I think we're not doing that. We're looking for something that helps to fix this or give us visibility.
and I think human nature is like that. We always want a shortcut. We don't want to do the hard work.
Of course.
Fortunately, it's like we all do. It's not,
absolutely. It's human nature, right?
So you had to. I'm pretty sure you had to make some difficult conversation. Or have to have difficult conversation with peers, with people they reported to you, or people that you consulted with, executives, board members, and so on. How do you deal with that? And again, you don't strike me like a person who's shy away from these conversations. Talk to me about that experience and how do you manage to deliver, because you don't want to hit them over the head with things that they've done wrong, but you still need to fix the problem.
No.
And it's a fine line between, again, being a consultative nature to be a bearer of bad news.
First of all, I never walk in and go, wow, you screwed that up. You're doing that all wrong. That's just bad karma. You don't want to do that no matter what, right? You try to focus on, one, not bringing in too much FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Don't try to scare people into some direction. Don't start throwing around acronyms like crazy. That's how we. That's how we won this battle, right? No, but I think is
and you shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't know. I think that it's funny you say that because
it's like,
here's one worse.
It's like a lawyer tells you not to sue.
Well, yeah. Well, there's a slight sidebar is I've seen things, right? And so when you know what's possible, there's guys out there and gals that have seen some gnarly things, right? So when somebody's talking like this, you're like, don't worry about it. You're like, you don't know. You know what I mean? You don't know. Like, they're like, oh my God, they hacked this. That's nothing. That's nothing. Forget it. So in some ways, that experience, those scars, those burn marks, you've seen some really gnarly things, and you know it really isn't a possibility. We're just winging it in some cases, okay? So when they're really freaked out about something here, you don't need to enhance that freak out, or you don't need to start playing like that. What you do is that's where that pragmatism comes into place, right? So I think delivering bad news or having these types of conversations, part of it is getting to know your audience a little bit, right? When I was at HP, I think it was, I had a leader there taught me a really good lesson. Maybe it was HP, might have been before then, but it was know what other people need to get done to be successful, right? So we tend to be very much like what makes us successful, which is natural, of course, and we got to keep our eye on that. But people you're working with, like this particular person in the organization, how are they measured for success? What are their career objectives? What are they trying to accomplish? And how do they make their money? How are they going to get their bonus? That kind of stuff like that, right? So you find ways of connecting with people and understanding how to frame things in such a way that they can relate to it personally and professionally and in the world they're operating in, so they can translate it to risks that they're gonna deal with. And those could be predominantly cultural and political risks, right? So when you go tell a business unit like, hey, you just install this application, you've exposed the company, and by the way, we've already found bad guys in there, we're just gonna have to figure this out, right? And I got you, right? You know what I mean? That kind of thing. But
It's a lot of EQ, sounds like it. Like
it is, and it's not my strong suit by imagination, but I think is just recognizing people are people. People make mistakes, and you're not there to sort of correct that problem. You're there to help them through the next phase of this activity. And also recognizing that you have a responsibility, especially if you're, the security leader of that group. You don't want to just sit there. Like, I always giggle about this as people go, well, you need the CEO to sign off on risk. And I'm like, man, you have not worked with a lot of CEOs, right? They're not going to sign anything. Most of them won't even send an email. Okay.
they don't even want to know about it.
Yeah. There's this weird, there's these things, again, you see crazy things and then you see what some people are talking about. There's just realities of the world and business, and you have to embrace that. You can't just live behind a dashboard or looking at your metrics or checking your firewall for holes. You really kind of understand how the things or mechanics are working around it. Yes, I've given a lot of people bad news. I'm sure a lot of people hate my guts, in some cases, but it's an evolving process.
Did you tell them not to shoot the messenger?
No, I try not to give a message that way that they want to shoot me. But sometimes it's also just ripping the Band-Aid off, right? You want to move them past those 5 stages of grief as quickly as possible, right?
And do you find that now where it's even worse because there's personal liability involved?
Yeah.
It seems like because of regulatory environment, it changes. The executives are now personally liable, including the board and the executive. And so that changes the dynamics from even before. It was like, okay, if something happens, well, bad luck, what can you do? Move on. But now it's really comes down to potentially even spending time in jail due to the fact that you've done the wrong thing.
So I would say is 2 really important things, right? Is I would say, first of all, CEOs, CFOs, general counsel, they've been exposed. Board of directors, this is nothing new to them. Okay. So let's be clear. This is new to the cyber community. The second thing I think is really important is, a lot of people, like we all do, understand that there's people that are potentially, faced with, the most famous being, was it Uber? Is that right?
Yes.
No. Yeah. Uber and
a couple other
and SolarWinds and stuff like that. But if you look back, kind of how things went down in both those cases, I think the Uber one was a little bit trickier. I think that was a little bit trickier, if I'm honest with you, because it had to do with it came down to emails and how things were sort of put together. I don't know if we'll ever really know exactly what went down. But I think in general is these liabilities do exist. So as you elevate yourself in the security executive community, be very mindful about what you're taking on, and then find ways of communicating effectively and the correct way and the right time and in the right way, right? So you always want to be careful what you put on paper. You always want to be mindful that if you're sending information, it has to fit within the context, right? In other words, I'm not saying obfuscate. What I'm saying is I'll give you, for instance, working with an organization, and they were playing around with Purview as an example, right? Which can kind of look for different dates. So you can say, monitor communications like Teams chats for, harsh language or bullying behavior or things like that nature. You don't just flip that on, right? You don't want to, because now that's a situation you're going to have to address, right? You would rather make sure you have the right HR policies, the right communication, that you've handled it. And then now you're turning this on to make sure that you're monitoring for, compliance, right? That's a very different discussion than like, oh, this is cool technology, we're going to flip it on for 1,000 people, right? Now you have to deal with it, and you're reacting to it. So that's the difference between understanding, liabilities and responsibilities and how that your role in the broader business. And to kind of put one more point on it is, it's interesting when people say, well, the risk just doesn't understand, the board just doesn't understand risk. You got to dumb it down. I can assure you these people understand risk. I can assure you that the general counsel understands risk. I can assure you the board of directors understand risk. They have it coming from all different directions. Our job is to frame it in such a way that it fits within that formula, fits within how they're managing risk as an organization, right? And I think dumbing it down isn't the right necessarily approach. Well, the same goes for just the philosophy of dealing with technology and understanding how you're going through this process and making sure that you understand the outcomes of your actions or inaction, right? Educate yourself on how you're approaching those things and how you do that. That's the biggest thing. Look before you leap.
And if not to add to the complexity, now with cyber insurance is becoming mandatory to some. In the insurance companies have made a significant change in the past several years in terms of how they perceive risk and how to provide you the right amount of risk coverage for you and through third parties. Does that change at all, like from your perspective, how organizations should like look at their security posture? Because a lot of times they can't get enough coverage the following year because due to the fact they're not compliant from a security standpoint, you don't have maybe MFA or don't have least privilege or whatever the case may be, and the cybersecurity, cyber insurance is something that's mandatory. Like they can't just not renew.
It is changing a lot of things, some good, some bad. I'm actually pro cyber insurance, but it's sort of manifesting in the wild a little bit differently in some cases. I think organizations I've seen them suffer a little bit from saying, yeah, we do that check to get the premium so we can get it insured. And what they don't understand is like when something does happen and you get investigated, the priority is basically, hey, you didn't do this, so we're not going to pay that, $15 million to get you back online kind of thing, right? So cyber insurance is you have to do what is expected of you. And that's why you get the premium that you did, because they've set through, their understanding of that environment, which insurance companies have a very good understanding. If you think about history of insurance, it's actually had huge influences on things like fire management and manufacturing and, all these kind of things, because they're like, hey, this caught off building codes, all of that, right? So I'm very pro cyber insurance because it's setting us on a path to drive more pragmatic, more effectual type of security controls, right? So I think we're going to start learning a lot more from the insurance industries, to be honest with you. And it has changed. I think in some cases it's improving because it's forcing organizations to implement certain controls, which is always good because sometimes organizations need that push, and it's one thing like PCI was a very early non-governmental regulation, right? It wasn't like HIPAA or GLBA kind of things or like that. It was the payment card industry going specifically in the beginning. It was Visa and MasterCard at the beginning. And so I think we saw meaningful incremental improvements in that way. And I think we're going to see the same thing in insurance. But yes, it does change a lot. But the bad side of that coin is they go, we got an insurance policy, we're good.
And I think that was, pre-pandemic, and somehow things have changed because you're right. A lot of times the insurance was in lieu of fixing things, but the insurance companies are not, they're not .org, they're .com. They're, they're not there to lose money, and they start building these, actuary tables where, if you're not, we'll insure you, but it's going to cost you so much that or we're going to insure you for the same amount, but you're going to get, 1/5 of the coverage. Yeah. By the way, that coverage does not cover, we don't know how much it costs to, once you have a breach, what's the day, 2 days, 3 days look like? And then, potentially what are the outcome of not being in business for a week?
Yeah. I liken it to buying car insurance and not doing maintenance on your car is what I think is happening a little bit right now. And your tire falls off while you're going 60 miles an hour down the highway and you get injured, right? At the end of the day, it was avoidable if you didn't have maintenance on a thing. And so I think people are hitting the insurance button and going, I'm good. There's a little bit of that going on. And I think insurance is going to get a little bit more rigid because the contracts are going to get tighter to the point where I hope these actuarial information and experiences that they're seeing that we're not generally, for obvious reasons, because there's a lot of activity that does not hit the wire a lot. and they're getting a good view into that. So I'm really hoping we start to see more of a trend of information coming out of those types of things. Especially recently, they did there was a report recently about the true top vulnerabilities, the top 20 kind of thing. It was very insightful. Of all the things we worry about, it really was these 10
And
things.
it is slow and steady, in terms of the insurance. I mean, they've been around for so many years. Yeah, started with Lloyd's, to be like, I don't know how many years ago. And so, but it gradually becoming more and more sophisticated. And so do you feel that eventually we'll have, how right now they say, well, if you plug this into your vehicle, you'll get a premium decrease because we know how you drive. Do you find potentially we'll have ability, something like that, but for insurance, we'll say, hey, you plug this into your network, and if we can potentially see how you drive or how your networks behave, we can give you a break on the security.
I think you're going to see that in cloud providers. I think the insurance community and cloud is going to start getting closer and closer. That's my belief. That's my belief. Because so much is in the cloud now, and it has basically digital pandemic issues. I mean, look at Move It. Look at these organizations that when you put all your eggs in one basket, the whole thing stands true, right? So when one thing fails, it takes a lot of companies with it, or has the potential to, right? We kind of take that as granted today, but there was a time when that was like completely unheard of, right? You know what I mean? You mean you're going to put all your stuff in this one place? I mean, people didn't like that, right?
And the cloud shared responsibility model where they assume that you just put it in there and it's secure. Yeah, well, it's secure, but not the underlying application is not secure.
Well, it went from, shared responsibility to sort of shared fate, and so there's a lot of organizations that handle security in the shared fate model differently. Okay. And I think, in my humble opinion, there's not quite enough transparency in those scenarios, especially with very fast moving cloud environments like Google, right? Google, Amazon are super fast. Not to say that Microsoft isn't fast, but Microsoft is servicing in more of a community that really prefers, how do I stand up my Microsoft server in a cloud, right? It's really more consistent theme. Whereas Google and those guys seem to be like really constantly pushing the edge and making changes and, really dynamic. And so you kind of like, where does my responsibility start and stop? And what does it look like? And how do I control it? And those become very, very fuzzy. But I think that's where insurance providers are going to say, hey, especially as IAC, you have infrastructure as code, that little device you plug in, you could just scan your code, right? So there's a lot of interesting things I think are possible, but that requires a lot of sophistication, a lot of investment, and a lot of upside. And I'm not really sure insurance companies make more money by lowering their premiums, right?
Yeah, I have so many questions, and we're getting to the top of the hour here, but it seems like there's always the latest and the greatest. We discussed briefly like third-party risk. Now there's a movement to do SBOM, software bill of material to review, and there's always been, the hype curve, right? There's always been something that was like on top of mind for security practitioners or the CISOs or whatever to, enterprise deal with projects, right? And then I think either Gartner dictates what's going to be the next project, but it seems like they're working on silos. They're fixing certain areas. Is this trend never ending where we're always going to be kind of the next project or the next area of concern and trying to fix it, but then not coming back and fixing like basic, mail hygiene or something like that where, we SBOM, like how many companies even know what they're, it's such an advanced concept to begin with.
Yeah. Now, but we could go down the list of things that I know in a year are going to be in a graveyard, right? And a list of other things that are just the rebranding of a rebrand of a rebrand of a rebrand of a rebrand, right? So it kind of goes back to a great place to stop, because it goes back to the beginning in some ways.
That's right.
We're trying to solve problems, and we're like, stop, we actually solved that. It's like lawmaking in the United States, right? Congress can't help themselves but get together and make 100 laws that duplicate, 50 laws that duplicate 5, right? So the net of it is again, it comes down to is where's the motivation to actually do the work, right? Sometimes you just have to do the work, like see it through from beginning to end. Granted, we have the added complexity of improved technologies, right? So as things improve, and now all of a sudden you have this one company doing one thing and it kind of slides across, and now everybody's kind of doing it, and then it becomes somewhat standardized, and then now we got this. So some of that is because there's a natural echo in that development and that innovation horizon. So I get it, right? There's new cool things coming out that you want to embrace. But there are some things where it's kind of like, don't forget, we need to do this. And I'll add one more comment, if I may, is one of the things I see is also people that line up to fight something as it's finally becoming adopted. I mean, MFA has been around forever, like ever. Okay. And so now it's finally becoming mainstream. People, insurance companies are pushing it, compliance is pushing it. And then now you have this whole stack of people going, MFA is terrible, you can hack it. Yeah, but not as easily as hacking a password by itself, right? So just be quiet. Let's just move forward. Let's move on, move past. Let's get on with the next big thing,
And
right?
it's so true.
We're never going to get past it.
Because it's so true. So Jim, it's been a phenomenal. I feel like we have to have an episode 2 of this because I
think so.
Every time you say something, I got 3 more questions I got to ask. So
Is that a good thing?
Yeah, no, it's great. It's phenomenal. But before we part ways, what's the easiest way for people to reach out to you? Just to know more, to consult, whatever the case may be.
I always tell, just send me an email, jimtillersecurity@gmail. That's an easy button. I look at all my email that comes through, and I would say maybe reach out to me on LinkedIn. But sometimes it gets lost in the whole LinkedIn thing.
Yeah,
but I'm fine just putting out my email. Yeah, I've had it forever.
Phenomenal. Jim, thank you very, very much for joining me today. Much appreciated. And all of those who joined, stay safe online as well as offline. I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.